and chairman of Executive Jet Aviation. You've all seen the Lears with the white fuselage and the pretty red and blue stripes come in here a lot and elsewhere, I'm sure. But really, to introduce this gentleman, I'd like to call on one of our own members who is mainly responsible for having General Tibbets come down and honor us with his visit. This man flew with him in North Africa, and he promised to make his introductory remarks in 3 minutes. So time him, and if 3 minutes go by, hold up your hand and he'll stop. But to introduce General Tibbets and his wife, I'd like to give you Ed Hicks, Dr. Ed Hicks of Moorhead, Kentucky.
General, Mrs. Tibbets, Dr. Gumbert, and members of Kentucky Aviation History Roundtable, guests, ladies and gentlemen, to be awarded the honor of presenting General Tibbets to this fine audience is the opportunity to participate in a labor of love. The love of our old Air Force unit, the 97th Bombardment Group. And we still like to believe it was the first and still the finest. It seems a certainty that the majority of you remember our guest's name with the action that occurred that August afternoon over Hiroshima. But this evening, I'm hoping that this brief introduction will be accepted as a prologue to General Tibbets' career and the style in which we of the 97th Group remember him. We first saw him as a young captain, attempting to whip a squadron into shape from a mixture of regulars, draftees, and second lieutenants, while instructing fledgling pilots how to handle a four-engine aircraft. We also remember another August afternoon, this time in 1942, when as a pilot of Flying Fortress number 2578, he led the first flight of American crewed B-17s over the continent. Between missions over Europe, he also ran a ferry service to Gibraltar, first with General Clark and later with General Dwight Eisenhower. A week later, a touch of excitement was added at Maison Blanc Aerodrome in Algiers when Paul touched down with General Clark. A stick of bombs missed the Red Gremlin by a margin of 100 feet. 2 nights later, the Luftwaffe returned, and the blast from one bomb removed Major Tibbets from his stool in the operations shack. Other bombs destroyed 2 B-17s on dispersal points. November the 16th saw another first, the initial attack on Bizerta by Allied aircraft. The flight consisted of 6 B-17s, led once again by Paul Tibbets. On this new front, bombing missions came with regularity until the lack of supplies and protection for the base caused the group to move to Tafaroy Airfield near Oran. The rainy season made the area famous, for GIs wrote poems about the brand of mud that was found at Old Oran. Lacking both basic equipment and ground crews, the air crews did it all, even handing out 5-gallon cans of gasoline to the men on the wings, until 2,780 gallons filled the tanks. The cans were then used for patching flak holes, which began appearing with great regularity. It was considered good news when orders arrived sending the group to Biskra, in the desert south of the Atlas Mountains. The field was fine, for 3 planes could take off abreast. But the bad news was that the supply department issued dust respirators to the ground crews. It was at Biskra, the land of scorpions, sandstorms, a shortage of supplies, and more work than one thought possible, that Paul Tibbets would bid us farewell. As the most experienced airman in the American forces, General Doolittle Beckett. Now, at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Paul headed the operations staff for the 12th Command. It has been a long journey from the Garden of Allah at Biskra to the heart of the brass. But Paul is here this evening to tell us of the many twists and turns along the way. So it is with pride and pleasure that I present to you General Paul W. Tibbets. Paul?
Thank you very much. And I'm very appreciative of the introduction, but maybe you are confirming to these people what I was about to tell them, and that is that in case you didn't know it, you're looking at a drunkard, a man that's crazy, that's been in a monastery, a recluse, all kinds of things. Now all of those come from our good friends over in Russia as a part of the disinformation that they started with in about 1951. Sometimes looking back and listening, I really wonder if I did have good sense. Now, Andrea and I are both delighted to be here. I am particularly delighted because of my association with the things that you people believe in, namely airplanes flying and all that goes with it. I told the good doctor that I have no formal type of a speech to make. I don't believe in that. I'm going to say a few things I hope will spark some kind of curiosity in the different minds that are out here in front of me, and then I'll roll up my sleeves and we'll start going at the questions and answers, because I would rather tell you what you want to hear than what I think you should hear. So let's start. I'll go back and as far as 1933. 1933, I was in the University of Florida pre-med school, and I had such a desire to fly airplanes that I began to wonder why I was doing it. When I came up to Cincinnati and got in med school up there after one semester, one term of it, I knew that airplanes were for me. The bug had bitten. I had disobeyed my father, which I normally didn't do too much because he had determined I was going to be a doctor. He would never let me get near an airplane or a motorcycle because he said the only thing that scared him in World War I was a ride in the sidecar of a dispatch motorcycle, and the other was a flight in an airplane. And he knew that, you know, anybody that did either one of those things was absolutely crazy, and he didn't want, you know, his son to be identified as one of those crazy kids. Well, the bug had bitten because I'd been bootlegging a little bit flying time off of a guy that had a J3 Cub, and I got really serious about it. I was lucky enough that my father gave me a pretty good allowance, and I kept using a large part of that allowance. I didn't buy too much gasoline from an automobile, and I ate sandwiches instead of beefsteaks. And I got a little bit of time, just enough to, I guess, whet the appetite and make me want to really learn to fly, because I wasn't learning to fly. I could mechanically maneuver an airplane, but I didn't call that, in those days, I didn't call that really flying. Where do you go to learn? You either went to the Navy or the Army. I applied to the Army Air Corps, got word back real quick to go get a physical exam, all of that at Wright-Patterson. Found myself here at Fort Knox, Kentucky about less than 90 days later as a sworn in as a flying cadet, and went to Randolph. Now from there I'm going to skip and we went through some wonderful training. I think I had probably some of the finest gentlemen that I can possibly imagine try to teach me what they knew about flying. And remember this, in those days we did not have a formal program such. We had a curricula that had to be followed. You had to learn so much in the ground school, you had to learn so much in the air. But your instructor could teach you the manner in which he wanted to teach you. So we were taught in the shadow of them that was flying in the back seat with us. And as I say, I had some excellent instructors. I learned a tremendous amount from them. When it came time to graduate, I called my father in Miami, Florida, and said, come on up to see the graduation. He reluctantly came to San Antonio to see it. After being there for 3 days, 2 days prior to the graduation and 1 day, he got to meet the men that were my instructors, and he got to see some of the things that we're doing. And he reluctantly admitted to me in one of the downtown bistros where we were having a beer, he said, I'll have to take back all of the things that I said. He said, I think that you had the opportunity to learn something from a bunch of men that know what they're doing. I'll skip from that and get into the business of flying airplanes for the military. My first assignment was Fort Benning, Georgia. At Fort Benning, Georgia, I was thrown into an organization that had, when I arrived there with a classmate of mine, there were 6 pilots. We had 31 enlisted men. We had 4 airplanes. They were old types. One of them was, at that particular time, was about 20 years old. The rest of them were closer to the age of 15 years. We had O-43s, O-46s, and BT-2s, if you know what those airplanes are. BT-2 was a biplane, the others were monoplanes, high wing. I was given an opportunity at that particular time to fly all I wanted to fly because the men that were there, the other 4 officers that were pilots, were older than I was, and my classmate by the name of Marvin Zip. So we had the opportunity of those airplanes. We could fly anywhere we wanted to, any time that we wanted to, with only one limitation. That limitation initially was, we first arrived, I don't know how many of you know Will Tunner from Ferry Command, the hump days and so forth, but anyway, Will Tunner was my operations officer, the first lieutenant. And he took us up to the board, and he had a U.S. map up there, and he took a string and a pen, and he drew a circle, which was in a 200-mile arc from Fort Benning, Georgia. He said, when you and my classmate Marvin Zip, he said, when you two have landed in every one of those airfields, I'll let you take your first cross country. So we had our work cut out for us, and I'm telling you, we landed in fields that had the weeds mowed out of them in probably in a year to a year and a half. And if you ever saw anything funny, you ought to see some of that brush down there in Georgia and Florida fly when you set one of those airplanes in there with that prop turning. But we did. We didn't know any better. You fly around, you take a look at it, and down you go. You just land. One time I got a big surprise. I did that, and the airplane bogged down to almost 30 inches of mud, and there it sat. We had to go dig it out with shovels, and the boss, his name was Robinson, but Will Tunner and Robinson, they gave us a truck. My classmate followed me in. They gave us a truck, they gave us shovels, ropes, and everything else. They said, go dig them out. So we spent about 3 days trying to dig those airplanes out of the mud. Now, with this type of freedom and flying the way I was allowed to fly, I didn't have to fly on anybody's wing. And that was the part, I guess, griped our classmates from the flying school. They for 1 year's time, they could never fly an airplane alone. They had to fly on somebody's wing. With this, and with the good Lord taking care of us, we managed to acquire probably more experience in a shorter length of time than many people before us and many people after us had the opportunity to do. 3 years almost at Fort Benning, and at that time I was in a position I had time in different airplanes, even twin engine jobs, because we had a job of towing targets with D-10s for the Coast Artillery while they would shoot at them. And that is the targets, not us. We'd do that all summer long. We'd run those missions, and each one of those missions was 10 hours. So we'd be sitting up there towing a target back and forth on the range for 10 hours at a clip. So it doesn't take you too long to build up time doing that. With that, the war clouds were gathered, because now we're in 1940, and the war clouds are gathering. The rules and restrictions that had applied on people to fly twin engines when I was a second lieutenant out of the flying school. You could not fly a twin engine airplane unless you had 5 years service as a pilot and at least 1,000 hours. You could not get in a B-17 till you had 15 years of service, and you had to have 4,000 flying hours. That was your requirement just to get in the airplanes as a co-pilot. All right, they had to lower the requirements, and on the basis of that, I happened to hit the category that had to go to flying A-20s. Now I'll tell you how crazy we were. Our outfit was the third attack, and they were good. I was a junior birdman in that thing by a long ways when I got assigned to it. It was a Savannah jet. We took those A-20s. We had to test the air raid defenses up and down the United States. Now you tell me if you can think of anybody, or you do know anybody, that has ever flown through the streets of New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston below the level of the buildings, and you know what I'll do in Times Square. But we did. We went right through those cities because they sent us out over the water. We had to come back in it. There were no rules. There was no such thing as an FAA. We had CAA, but they didn't do things like the FAA do today. They didn't have it, but this was a necessity to check those things. So we would actually test those systems by down through those cities. Each one of them had street. Now it sounds silly, but they were all checked out ahead of time, and we were thoroughly briefed on which street we were going to fly down, and we did this on the basis of the leader, flight leader, taking us, and he would take each wingman would get this next block over. And we knew how we could go without running into wires and things like that. So it's a lot of fun to go down through those towns. Okay. War comes along, and I think Ed's covered it better than I can. We got into B-17s. Prior to getting the 97th out, I don't know if Ed remembers this or not, but in those days, again, we had young people coming out. Well, my gosh, I wasn't an old man then. But anyway, we had younger people coming to the flying schools that had little or no experience in any airplane, let alone twin engine or four engine. And I found myself for about 90 days trying to get pilots qualified to fly B-17s for the 97th. I was flying 3 6-hour training periods a day in B-18s to get enough twin engine time so that we could put them in a four engine. And I got my sleep in one of the towers of the hangar, and I fit pretty well, put my fanny down in the opening of a B-17 tire, my feet up on one side, and my head went on the other side. You can sleep pretty good that way, especially when you're tired. They were hectic days, admittedly, but let me tell you, it weren't any harder on me, or probably as hard on me as were a lot of people. I'm just trying to say that it wasn't all easy. Now, I think the next thing to do is to come back to a B-29 real quick. Eddie Allen got killed. I hate to tell you my memory, I don't remember the exact date, but it was in 1943, probably February or early March of 43 when he got killed. And this is when Doolittle tapped me to come back to the States because, by his words, General Arnold wanted somebody back there that was a field grade officer that had wartime experience to get on this airplane to see if we could work bugs out of it before it was introduced into combat. Because with the B-17, it was a long ways from bug-free. We had a lot of bugs in the B-17s, cost a lot of lives to start with. We wanted to try to avoid as much of that as we could, so I started flying B-29s. And I think about the first 6 months that I flew B-29s, without contradiction, I can tell you that I had more twin engine and three engine time in that airplane than anybody's ever logged. Because that was our problem. We had engine problems. They were underpowered. The engine was a well-designed engine, but it was not developed. They got awfully hot. You couldn't get the ignition system. Magnetos and ignition wires wouldn't stand up under the strain. So you had a problem with that, and the carburetors wouldn't put fuel in all of the cylinders. So we worked on those things as hard as we could, and we alleviated many of them. The armament system was another problem, and we worked on that. Finally, we pushed those airplanes out to the CBI theater. Now, after it was done, then, because I had a reasonable amount of B-29 experience, I was sent to Grand Island, Nebraska to start a B-29 instructor school. I went down there, but I didn't stay there very long because there's a more important project going on now in New Mexico, and this has a bearing on something to come later. Dr. E.J. worked at the University of New Mexico, head of the physics department, had a project assigned to him by the United States government to test the vulnerability of the B-29 airplane to fighter aircraft. We had all the U.S. fighters, we had Spitfires, and we had one Jap Zero down there. So we would take that airplane, and with other instrumented airplanes, we would do specific fighter curves on the B-29 at different altitudes and so forth, so that all of this stuff could be measured, and the doctor could come out and actually analyze the information he had, and there would be some validity to it. I learned something then that served later, because one of the test B-29s that we had was incapable of being operated. I don't know, it was grounded for something. We needed to have another airplane, and I just happened to have one there that I used to fly around. I bet I'm the only one you ever saw that had a B-29 four-engine flying machine to use an administrative airplane. But that's what I had. I had an airplane that had no armament, it was just a flying machine. And I took that thing and I went up to make this fighter curves flight and allow that to be done. Inadvertently, because the airplane was so light compared to the other ones, I wasn't paying too much attention. The airplane started, as it lightened up when the fuel started drifting higher and higher. And I'm not paying any attention to it until they called my attention to the fact that the fighters couldn't touch me. I was about 3,000 to 4,000 feet higher than they could operate. Well, that was a mistake at that time, because the object was to get data. When I got assigned to, my next assignment went to the bomb project, and when I got into the bomb project, got briefed on what had to happen and so on, got my crews and all that lined up and went out to Wendover, Utah. Y'all know where Wendover is? It's 125 miles west of Salt Lake City, right up against the Nevada border. Bob Hope was there with a USO show one time, and he looked around the place. He said, I don't know why the hell they call it Wendover. They ought to call it Leftover. But anyway, we got out to Wendover, and one of the things that the question in my mind was, when I knew that I had to go over there, I had to fly a single airplane, is the question, how do we, avoid Japanese interception, anti-aircraft and all that? The answer was high altitude. Now, the B-29s that were operating out of the CBI and were starting to operate out of the Marianas were heavily laden with armament. Matter of fact, we carried 7,200 pounds of armament there, counting machine guns, ammunition, armor plate, and all that. It was 7,200 pounds of weight. And I figured, gee, if I get rid of 7,200 pounds of weight, I can get about 5,000 feet more altitude. And that's what I did. Well, that was the first place that I really got officially accused of being crazy. Kurt LeMay he knew that I had lost my mind. You didn't take an airplane into combat unless it had all kinds of guns and armor plate on it. I explained to him what my rationale was for it, and he said, well, goddammit, excuse the language, but he talked that way. He said, you got to live with it, so if you want to do it that way, I can say, nothing I can do about it now, it's too late. And it was. I mean, I had an authority given to me is today, as I look back, it's unbelievable. I could get almost anything that I wanted by asking for it and use a code name for the project, which was silver plate. One of the things that I wanted one time was I had to be operating in a veil of secrecy. I had to be a lone operator. This was all explained to me at the very beginning. I had to operate on my own. I had to do everything on my own. Nobody was going to back me up, particularly the two-star general that gave me the project, because he said, I can't do it. It'll violate secrecy if I do. You have to do everything on your own. It will attract less attention. Good. Now, I needed some transport airplanes to haul things around for the scientists. We had a lot of things that had to be acquired from different locales where they're manufactured, because the bomb manufacture was spread out all over the United States, from Hanford, Washington to Tullahoma, Tennessee. And in between all of that, depending on what it was that had to be manufactured for that thing, it had to be picked up by air, really, and delivered either to Los Alamos or to Wendover. And to do that and get any decent service, I just needed transport airplanes of my own. And I had a fascination for DC-4s, which were brand new at that particular time, so I put in a requisition that I wanted 5 DC-4s. Nothing happened. Now in Washington, there was one officer in the air staff besides General Arnold who was acquainted with what I was doing. I was told that if I ever ran into a roadblock and I couldn't overcome it by myself, to talk to this officer, and he would give me the right kind of assistance. His name was Ben Wilson. I put in my requisition and nothing happened on it, and I got nervous about it. I sent in another requisition, and this time I got a call from the allocations office of a brigadier general in charge of that allocations office. And I got a call come to him and explained why I wanted those airplanes. So I went to Washington, I went to his office, and he said, "Why do you want those airplanes?" And the answer I could give him is, "Because I need them." And by this time he was a little bit unhappy with me. And he said, "What are you trying to do, start Tibbets 1st Individual Air Force?" And I said, "No, sir." But I said, "In the work that I'm doing, I need them." And he said, "What's your work?" I said, "Well, that I can't explain to you, but it's important." He said, "I don't care how important it is, you can't have it." He said, "Ferry Command needs those airplanes." "Yes, sir." And I went out. Well, I went by Wilson's office, told him what my problem was, and he said, "Let me handle it." I wasn't there to see it, but I was told that in due course, as a matter of fact, a couple of 3 days' time, if my memory served me right, Wilson called me up and he said, "You remember your C-54s? You remember the man that didn't want you to have them?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I got called up to General Arnold's office." Wilson. And he said, "I understood that the general was coming up there and that we were both going to see General Arnold." Fine. And he said, "I was called in first because I arrived ahead of the general, and I was called in first, and Arnold was doing something." He said, "Sit down." He said, I sat down. He said, pretty quick, the general came to the door, and he stopped in the doorway, and Arnold said to him, "Good morning, Major." And his staff, Arnold's staff, was there because they followed him in. They knew something was up. And that was all it was said, except that Arnold said, "Now," he said, "I said one time in this Pentagon, if an requisition came in with the word silver plate on it, they would get it." He said, "I don't care what it is." He said, "I'm not going to say it again." Now that's the kind of thing that we had going at that particular. Now believe it or not, I did violate that, I guess you'd call it trust or responsibility, because I did order some things one time that were really not needed for the bomb project. I went over to Tinney and made a visit over there, and I saw all the fellows that were over there at that particular time. They had constructed washing machines using oil drums with wooden paddles for windmills to pump up the plunger up and down and to wash, so they could wash their clothes. And I thought, now that my guys deserve better than that, so I put in a requisition for 12 Maytag gasoline motor-driven washing machines. I flew a B-29 to Chicago and picked them up. Believe me, we did not endear ourselves to those guys on the island when we showed up with our washing machine. But anyway, that's a different story. Now, the other part of the thing, I think you've heard and read all that anybody could talk about as far as the flying of the mission is concerned. I still maintain that it was probably one of the best executed missions that ever took place in history of warfare to that time. Air Force, did not break security under any condition, and I was investigated for 7 years after that, every time something came up. And one of the last incident that caused an investigation to be made was when the Rosenberg were arrested and jailed for giving secrets to the enemy. Before we were ready to load the airplane, I thought that we better do something to attract attention away from that airplane and the loading area and all that. So I had a real good MP outfit that belonged to me personally in my 509th composite group. With that MP group, I called in Lou Schaefer, the commander, and I told him, along with one of the ordnance people, I wanted them to take one of the old bomb crates. We had some like-sized objects that we dropped for practice purposes that resembled the final shape of the atomic weapon, but they were just high explosive bombs. They had to explode on detonation. I mean on impact with the ground. That's where they got detonation. But I had to take one of those crates and set it out there and put a guard on duty. And I said, now instruct your guard to act like he's asleep. And if there's anybody around that's curious, they'll fall for that. I was a student in the War College in 1953 when a pompous lieutenant colonel from the Inspector General's department came in and he wanted to talk to me. So they excused me from class or from seminar, and I went to talk to this man. And he showed me all of his credentials and so forth, and he says, now, I want you to explain this picture. And there was a picture of my guard sleeping in front of this box. And I started laughing. I said, well, it took a little while to get here, but here it is. What are you talking about? So I told him what I've told you. It made him so damn mad he folded up everything he had and he went out and left. I said, you know, they fell for it. That ended all the investigations. But I'm so proud of that group because they could fly airplanes, they could navigate, they could bomb, they could do all the things, and they could raise more hell than any group of people you could imagine because they had to let off steam. I mean, we were isolated from the rest of the world. And I was reciting earlier here this evening that when I understand that General Lee Wade talked to this group of people, I met Lee at Batista Field in Havana, Cuba, because I wanted to get my guys to training flying over water, coming in off of water to a land contrast and dropping bombs on a land range. That's a little bit different than flying over land all the time and doing it. I wanted to get that training. Besides, I wanted them to celestial navigate and not to use any of the so-called navigation means that we had in those days, electronic as they were. I didn't want them to use that. They had to be celestial navigators or they had to navigate by the sun or the other. Those were the two requirements, and we were pretty stiff on that. Two of the crews were off on a weekend. They went down into Havana to have a good time. They got themselves rooms in a hotel. I don't know what else they did. I didn't ask them. But anyway, next time I was down there, Lee Wade called me in. He said, you got a couple of real, ambition, I would say rather strong type crews there. And I said, what do you mean, General? Or he was Colonel. I said, what do you mean, Colonel? He said, well, he said, all of this little incident occurred. He said, these guys were down there, and he said, I saw the competitiveness of the crews just from one day to another, watching them drop bombs and checking results and betting money on who could drop the bomb the closest, who could navigate the best, and all that sort of thing. He said, I saw all that going on. I thought it was a great spirit. But he said they carried it a little too far because he said they got downtown the hotel, and apparently after they had a few drinks, the competitiveness came out again, so they took the fire hoses down from the wall. They started using the fire hoses with a water battle. And he said the people down there really, the Cubans didn't take too kindly to that. And he said, I got called in on it. End of story. He said, I told the fellas that I wouldn't carry it any further if they'd pay for the damage because the hotel people would be happy if that happened. So he said, I collect the money, we paid it and so forth. But he said, we got a little procedure now. He said, I talked to all the crews, tell them they're going to have a water fight, come on up to the barracks. They can have one of the barracks and do all the fighting they want. And I thought that might illustrate, as I say, the type of people that they were. They were so good. Don't know what else I can say for them. I've opened up Pandora's box. We can talk about anything that you want to talk about. I'll try to give you the best explanation I got. If I don't have one, I will tell you that. So who wants to try me first? I got one deficiency, and that is nobody told me years ago that propeller tip noise would hurt your hearing. And when we first got around jet airplanes, I didn't know that you couldn't stand in front of one of them with engines running and, do something. But I know now that that's not the proper thing to do. So I do, she'll verify I do have a hearing problem. But if you'll shout at me, I'm sure that we can make out all right. I don't know how to begin, please.
Is it right that your plane was named for your mother, and also is she from Pennsylvania?
All right. The airplane was named for my mother, and her family were Pennsylvania Dutch and went out to Iowa in covered wagons. Don't ask me when, but my grandma at that time was 3 years old, my mother's mother. The idea there was, in those days, wartime days, people had all the names on airplanes. Some of them were in honor of cities, in honor of girlfriends, I don't know, anything that you wanted. I wanted that airplane to be named something that I felt would not be duplicated anywhere that I could think of. Well, my mother's name was Estrangement in those days, and I felt that that was a pretty safe bet that there would be no other airplane named Enola Gay. Also, she took my side when I wanted to go fly against the old man. She just made it. Under the old man and everything, but boy, what he was hot about this when I finally told him I was already a flying cadet. We were sitting at the luncheon table, and he was hot under the collar. And she looked at me and she said, she didn't give him too much mind. I mean, she never excited about very many things and hardly ever cracked a smile, except the corner of her mouth would wrinkle a little bit. But she looked at me. She said, Paul, if you want to go fly an airplane, you'll be all right. Well, I can remember a lot of occasions I said, well, Mom said I'd be all right, so. Who will throw another one?
You'll notice there's a Baby Ruth candy bar placed. Tell us about the wreath, please.
I explained earlier that my father did not want me to get in an airplane. Let's go back to my tender age of, I don't know, 6 years old or 5 years old. I was visiting with my mother up in her hometown in Iowa, a little place called Glidden, Carroll County, 90 miles northeast of Des Moines, Iowa, 7 miles from the county east of the county seat called Carroll. In those days, carnivals, circuses, and everything advertised their arrival by having a barnstormer with them. The barnstormer would go around all the little country towns. This town had 928 people in it. That's what the outside sign said when you drove in, Glidden population 928. This airplane came over Glidden and started buzzing the place and doing Immelmans and loops and all that kind of stuff. I didn't know what they were in those days, but anyway, boy, I'm standing there watching that airplane. My uncles all came out of the field where they're plowing. They put the horses in the barn, and everybody got in Model Ts, and we went the direction that that airplane would fly and go west, and it'd come back and then go west again, meaning go west, young man. And that's where the carnival is. And sure enough, just on the outskirts of Carroll, there was a large field there, and they were setting a business there, and this barnstormer was taking people for a ride for $1. And I wanted to go for a ride in that airplane. My mother, my uncles wouldn't let me do it, despite all the tears and everything else. They said, no, your father doesn't want you to ride in an airplane, and my mother said, I'm not going to take the responsibility of you getting killed. And so that was the story. Now, at the tender age of 13 years old, my father was in the wholesale confectionery business in Miami, Florida. He was the distributor for the state of Florida for Curtis Candies. They sent Doug Davis, racing pilot from Cleveland. They sent Doug Davis down there with his bike, and his job was to drop Baby Ruth candy bars, which about the size of, in those days, the nickel candy bar was about the size of 3 of these things, or even bigger. They were definitely a candy bar. He had acquired in some way paper parachutes that came packaged in one box, and the Baby Ruths in the big crates and in cardboard cartons. In my dad's shop, some of his employees, Doug Davis, I did, and everybody, we were taught how to attach these paper parachutes to the candy bar and wrap the chute around it, so when you dropped it out, the slipstream would open it up and they'd come floating down. Well, Dave said when he got all of the stuff packed up for the next day's journey out over the racetracks and the Miami Beach also, he said, I got to have somebody go with me to throw these things, help throw these things out. And I volunteered like that. My old man looked at me and he said, "Not you." Well, anyway, make a long story short, Doug came to my rescue and he talked to my dad for a look. He said, I don't know, he went through his credentials and he said, "I've been flying these airplanes, I'm married, I got children," and he said, "I'm not going to do anything to kill myself, let alone kill him." And so finally and a couple of the employees that worked with my dad, they were friendly towards me, and they pushed him a little bit, and he said, okay. He said, I'll let you go. So you can do it once. Well, I did it a little bit more than once after the first trip, but that was my introduction to an airplane for the first time, and needless to say, it was a thrill. The first ride that Doug gave me was straight, take off normal, climb on out, get over the racetrack, throttle back, and circle. Boy, we throw these chutes out, the whole place just filled full. Of course, running out of the grandstand, they were dropping on the racetrack and had to be picked up because they're afraid of scaring the horses, I presume. I mean, and obviously you don't leave debris on a racetrack, but people want to eat the candy too. We went to Miami Beach and did the same thing. That worked out so well I got to go again. The next time, Doug said, he got up there, we were riding along, we dumped all the candy. He said, "Do you ever do a loop?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I'll show you how it works." So he pushed down and opened the throttle up and did what I call a beautiful loop in those days. Of course, that's my first experience. And that helped too. That, that kind of convinced me that this is something different. And so that is the thing that confirmed my conviction that someday I had to fly an airplane. Any other?
At what point before the mission did you tell the crew, what the actual mission was to be, and what was the reaction to this explanation?
I can't answer the question exactly like you've answered, but let me tell you the introduction that I gave the crew. The first thing that I said to them after being assigned the job in September of '44 was that we were going to do something that was special. It was going to be different from the ordinary things that we had been doing with B-17s. It was going to be a bombing type mission with a weapon different than we had before. Fine. I asked them at that time. Now these are guys that I knew real well. I asked them at that time, I said, "Don't ask me to tell you more than I volunteered to tell you. I'll tell you what you need to know," because this is what they told me. "We'll tell you anything you need to know to do the job correctly. But you're better off not knowing too much." And on the basis of that, none of them gave me any kind of a problem at all. On the night before we went out on the mission, the bomb had been exploded at Alamogordo, and the one that was on the tower, it had been exploded. They had photographs of it. Now, they were sending some observers that had been there, had seen it, along with the pictures. They sent them out to Tinian, and they were there the night that the next night, that was the night we were going to take off. So, fine. I still didn't use the word atom bomb when I showed them the pictures and said, we're going to do this. The tactics that we were using were different than anybody. Why do you fly one single airplane at that altitude, and then after you release the bombs, why do you put it up basically on one wing, which we did was almost a 60-degree bank, pulling that thing around as fast as we could. And that, for some of you pilots, that's an interesting procedure, because we tried that for the first time. And the question, we had to turn that airplane almost 180 degrees within 50 seconds. That was the name of the game. So how do you take an airplane at 30,000 feet of that size and weight and turn it? Well, you just keep cranking in more and more and getting steeper and steeper till finally I was able to do it by just keeping a chatter in the tail, just keeping the tail stalling a little bit. And we worked it out. So we did 180, but really the scientists and the mathematicians said that you have to turn 157 degrees. That's the number of degrees you must turn, because the bomb will fall, it will explode, the shock wave will come back up on an ever-expanding circle. The way you get the greatest distance between yourself and an expanding circle is to get tangent to it. So 157 degrees is tangent. I didn't have it. I couldn't do that because it didn't have 157 degrees where I could read it on my gyro compass, but I had a 16 there, and I could read 160. So that's what we practiced on doing it that way. Now, on the way to the target, we had to arm the bomb. The atmosphere as such was out of those islands at that time of the year that they had a cloud deck that ran between 7,000 and 9,000 feet constantly. 9 would be top and 7 would be at the bottom of it. Broken clouds, scattered clouds, but it was a little bit turbulent. We had to have the smoothest air we could get so those guys could stand back bomb bay and insert the critical material into the weapon at that particular time, which is about roughly a 30-minute job. We took off, we climbed up. We did. We got the thing going, it all checked out, everything was fine. They came back out of the bomb bay, we pressurized the airplane and went merrily on our way. Now, when that was done, all of us had been up in excess of 30 hours. I personally, as far as I can remember, I'd been about 40 hours before without any sleep at that particular point. And I went back in the back of the airplane because crawled through the tunnel, went back, talked to the fellas in the back, got them in there. There were 4 of them back there, and I said, okay, now I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. My tail gunner by the name of Bob Karen was pretty smart. We're sitting on parachutes and whatnot back there. He looked at me, he said, Colonel, we're not playing with atoms, are we? And I said, yeah, that's what we're doing. He said, I thought so. Fellas up in the front, the bombardier and the nav flight engineer, co-pilot, we'd been working so close with it, it really wasn't necessary to tell anything. By that time, they already knew. But the words weren't used, and nobody asked. But that is the time at which I said, we are carrying an atomic weapon. I'll bring out one other thing that a lot of people don't know. I've been at Maxwell Field, and they got German students down, got Japanese students, and a few other things. I've talked similar to the way I'm talking now about the mission as such. My original directive was to train and prepare to use those weapons simultaneously in Europe and in Japan. That's the reason I was independent. That's the reason I had transport airplanes. Part of the reason. But I had to be a cohesive unit, and I had to have the capability for a split operation. So that's we had a little over 1,400 men. I had 15 B-29s and I had 5 C-54s. I had an ordnance squadron. I had an MP squadron. I had everything that normally you wouldn't have except the wing level. Had some interesting people in my ordnance squadron. I tell this, I don't know if you've read it, but the secrecy can be kept if it's necessary. In that organization that I had, and 3 of them were in that, I had 2 convicted murderers that had escaped from the pen, and I had 3 convicted felons that had escaped from the pen. This is how good the security guys were that worked on the Manhattan Project. The U.S. Army, the U.S. government, the FBI, and all of that sort of stuff hadn't picked these guys up. But these people had skills that you couldn't find. They were tool and die makers of the highest caliber. And I needed them. I needed those people badly in that outfit. And when I got the dossiers from the security people, they said, what do you want to do? I said, as long as those guys are doing what they're doing now, I want to keep them. Fine. I called them in, one at a time. I showed them, I called them by their right name. I showed them the dossier. And I said, now look, go back to your organization and you're going to be so-and-so as far as I'm concerned, Sergeant so-and-so, Corporal this or whatever. And when this war is over, you come to me and I will give you this dossier and I will give you the matches to burn it up. That's exactly what happened. Today, if my life depended on it, I couldn't tell you their names. I didn't want to know their names, didn't want to remember. But anyway, that's the way ahead. We've missed this side of the house.
Yeah. Did you ever actually pick a target in Europe, and if so, what were the targets?
Pick a target in Europe. Did you ever pick one?
No, we did not pick a target in Europe for the very reason that targeting as such was not considered until the end of April of 1945. That's when we did that. Now, That brings up a question. I'll volunteer an answer to the question. What targets were picked and why did you pick them in Japan? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Kokura were the 4 targets that were picked. They were picked because they had not been bombed by the 20th Air Force. They all were, believe it or not, despite what you read, they all were military-type targets. They all had some military significance. Hiroshima was the Southern Command headquarters for the armies that were being assembled to defend against invasion. I don't remember what the rest of them were, but anyway, that's the case there. Those targets were picked at that particular time. The 20th Air Force General made his people were told under no circumstances would they bomb the targets. That was done by General Arnold because scientists, the scientific element, wanted as virgin information as they could get as to the damage that would be caused to different kinds of structures, different types of things that existed on the surface of the earth at that time. And we went in right after the thing was over with. We beat the occupation forces into Hiroshima and Nagasaki both, and we took people in there and let them out, and they stayed there for weeks, making scientific observations and data and so forth. I went into Nagasaki and wandered all over that place just like an ordinary tourist, buying souvenirs. They were very famous for wood carvings in that place. They were good on rice bowls and trays. Unfortunately, the tray thing that the wood, when it dried out, it cracked. I never did keep it there. I still got some rice bowls in that day.
Did I understand you say that only one bomb has been exploded before?
Only bomb that exploded experimental before you dropped yours.
That's true. The one that was sitting on the tower at Alamogordo. Now that was the Nagasaki type bomb. There was a difference between the Hiroshima bomb, and there's a difference between the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb. The Hiroshima bomb was almost 100% sure as far as an explosion was concerned. Because what they're doing there, they were taking and bombarding a piece of pure uranium on one end into a piece of pure uranium on the other through actually a gun barrel. That's what they had in the center of that bomb, and they drove it with a charge of powder, and when you drive those two together at a certain velocity, they knew they would get a critical situation and there would be an atomic explosion. The Nagasaki bomb was of a different type of construction. It was called an implosion bomb, and what they had there was U-235, not pure uranium. They had U-235, and they had a ball in there, probably about the size of a softball, is as close as I could come. There were 36, it was a spherical shape, there were 36 blocks Horpex around that, and they were so well fitted, and they had to be so well fitted, I promise you, you couldn't get a cigarette paper to go between the blocks. There's no way. That's how close and how tight that the tolerance had to be. The explosion took place with champion spark plugs. In each one of those blocks of Torx, there was a spark plug there that was ignited by a barometric release, putting the batteries to throwing the current into each one of those spark plugs simultaneously so that they could crush that center ball of U-235, and that caused the explosion to take place at that time.
My next question was going to be, were you pretty certain that you were going to have an explosion when you dropped the first one?
Were you pretty certain you would have an explosion with the first one and the second?
Yeah. I felt confident. I think there's one other thing that took place at this particular time. The scientists wanted perfection. They wanted to experiment and experiment and experiment. I went over to Utah in April with an outfit that was well trained and ready to go. And I felt somewhat like a football coach. You know, you can overtrain if you don't look out. And on the basis of that, I ordered my outfit overseas. That's the only time I ever got in trouble with Leslie Groves. And it came out all right because he understood what was going on. I did order my outfit overseas. I should have checked with him before I did it, but I felt it was just wasting time. I had to get them overseas because I could urge the people on. I did this after talking with Dr. Oppenheim. And I said to Oppenheim, I said, what are we waiting for? He said, we want to be sure this weapon will explode. In other words, this barometric explosion mechanism will work properly. And I said, well, okay, fine. I think that's, you know, that's admirable, but what are the probabilities now of a failure? He said 1 in 10,000. I said, what are you looking for? He said 1 in a million. I said to myself, I'll take 1 in 10,000 odds any day of the week.
What do you think of the later investigation of Dr. Oppenheimer?
What do you think of the later investigation of Dr. Oppenheimer?
I think Oppenheimer was unjustly crucified. That's my personal opinion. Oppenheimer, listen, this is a man that you had to see to believe, and then when you saw him, you wouldn't. I never saw a brain like him. He lived in a world of all of his own. He never failed to admit when he was a college student, this idea of communism was great and so forth, it was a thing to do, and he joined the Communist Party and so forth. He never participated. They never proved that he participated in it because he didn't. But I can see his point of view. The type of brain that he is, I will illustrate by one story. And that is, at Los Alamos had been built originally as a hospital. And the way that Army military hospitals wartime were constructed in that time, you had a long corridor, and off of that corridor you had all kinds of bays. Between the bays you had offices for doctors and nurses or whatever. And this is what they were occupying, the scientific element were occupying this kind of a facility. I went there one day on business, which I had to do frequently, and I was met at the entrance to this hospital facility, office complex that they had by Dr. Oppenheim, and a man was a Navy captain that was assigned, Deke Parsons. The two of them met me. We started walking down the corridor. We were talking, Parsons and I were talking, because he and I talked back and forth frequently on these types of problems. As a matter of fact, if you got any further than that with Parsons or myself, we had to get another physicist, Dr. Norman Ramsey, because Ramsey had the unique ability to talk to the scientists in the terms that they understood, but he could also translate it into layman's language so we could understand. Okay, we're walking down there, we're doing some talking. We passed the doorway, I don't know, we might have taken 3 steps or 4 steps. Oppenheimer's on the door side or the wall side over there. He's on that side. He stops without saying anything, turns around and goes back. Parsons and I stop and follow him back, because he walks in this office, in this door to this room. The room, I'm guessing, I don't know, room might have been 25, 30 feet square, something like that. 3 walls were covered with backboard. A straight back chair in the middle. A man is sitting in that straight back chair, and all over these 3 boards are nothing but formulas. And I don't know, don't ask me what type. They might have been chemical, they might have been physics formulas, but anyway, I recognize formulas. Oppenheim stands there for a minute behind this man. He walks up to the board in front of him, and down in the left-hand corner he rubs something out, puts something else in there, and the man in the chair jumps up and claps his hands. He says, "I've been looking for that mistake for 3 days." That was Enrico Fermi. Oppenheim saw it walking by the door. How do you explain it?
On your crew, MBA, how many members did you have, and are they still living?
How many crew are they still living, and do you see each other?
There were 13 aboard that airplane. One of those 13 was this man Parsons that I mentioned. Parsons was the first to die. After the war, he got a destroyer division out in the Mediterranean. He died on board a destroyer of heart attack. The next man to go was one of my people by the name of Joe Staborik. Joe Staborik was a radar operator. Joe died. My co-pilot just recently died, about a year ago. Bob Lewis died, heart attack. All of those are heart attacks. My flight engineer, Wyatt Dusenberry, died again. Wyatt didn't die of a heart attack. He drank himself to death, unfortunately. Now, the bombardier, the navigator, myself, the radio operator, the tail gunner, and one of the mechanics, and forgive me, I can't think of his name, the assistant flight engineer, they are alive. The answer is, we've never made it a project to see each other or do anything like that. We keep in touch by telephone, note, or something of that type. We had a reunion last year in Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia, but I was the only one that made it from my crew. Two of the guys, Ed, remember Tom Farabee, the bombardier, and Van Kirk, the navigator, we were in the 97th together, and a little over, I guess it was 2 years ago now, we had a reunion in St. Louis, and both of those guys were there at the same time. Farabee's retired. He stayed in the military, retired as a colonel. He lives in Orlando, Florida. Van Kirk came from a family of chemists. He went through and became a chemist. He is now head of DuPont's division that DuPont has out on the West Coast. He's the vice president for marketing for them out there on the coast. That's about the most I can tell you about the crew. Yes.
Those of you who've been to the bomb site at Hiroshima,
When you went to Hiroshima,
saw any effects of radiation?
did any of those people have effects of radiation themselves?
Effective radiation. Again, I am not what you'd call a qualified person to discuss that, but there were no effects from radiation that anybody is aware of. One of the things that had been said that, if you wouldn't be able to have children and that sort of thing, well, my bombardier, who was probably closer to it than anybody else, he had 4 children after the war. The airplane did get some radiation. They had Geiger counters on it when we got back. But one of the things that are not too well understood is that at the distance that we were from those weapons at that particular time, the radiation was not as severe as it was on the surface of the Earth, obviously. The next thing is radiation, as I understand it and as I saw it, water does a whole lot. We flew through rain going back. The airplane got washed a little bit. When we went to Nagasaki, of course it was raining, I won't say constantly, but it was a lot of rain in Japan. It could rain there just as easy as could be. And as we walked around it in nothing but shorts, shoes, and shirts, not even thinking, nobody even mentioned radiation to us. And we wandered around that place for 2 days. So the answer is, at the Bikini Project, the same thing happened. We were exposed to it to some degree, but it had no effect on us that we know of. Nothing's ever shown up I'm aware of.
Anything that you remember about the crew that went on the second raid and that mission? Anything outstanding or significant that you remember about that?
The second mission, flown by airplane commander named Charles Sweeney. Sweeney had been with me on the testing of the B-29s. The bombardier, Kermit Behan, had been with us in the 97th Bomb Group over in England. Those were the first people that I requested by name when I got this project assignment, because I knew, first off, we had to fly an airplane and fly well. The second thing I knew was we had to bomb well, we had to navigate well. And I knew that those people could do those things, and I brought them into that. Now, when it came time to select the crews to go, the question has been raised, and some people have said that they didn't know why I did it, or other people have said they should have done it instead of me, and so forth. I, of course, would disagree with this. I was given the assignment. I had the full responsibility. The next thing is, I was not prone to let anybody make a mistake for me. And had that taken place, I'm sure that those people that have since said they were supposed to do it would not have accepted the blame for it. So responsibility of command is something that you have to be in that position to understand what it means, and I felt that it was my responsibility to try it for the first time. I told Sweeney, following me in, I had him follow me in on that mission. I said, if I make a mistake, and we talked on the radio constantly on the bomb run, I said, if I make a mistake, I don't want you to make the same one that I did. Sweeney had never been shot at. I didn't know if we were going to be shot at or not. I didn't think we would be. But on the other hand, I knew Kermit Behan had been shot at. He'd been shot up, and a few other things in Europe. And I knew that there was a cool customer and I had an agreement with Sweeney that he would do exactly what Kermit Behan told him to do. He said, if Kermit tells me to fly the airplane upside down, he said, I'll try it. I said, that's fair enough for me. And when they went in, they did run into some trouble because they had a malfunctioning valve on a Bombay fuel tank, and they were running short on fuel, and they ran into bad weather because, again, they waited too long to try to get another airplane to rendezvous with them at Iwo Jima. And that was part of the procedure, was to pick up the escort airplanes, one on each wing to carry instruments, and out of Tinian to go to Iwo Jima, over Suribachi at a 360 and take out for the shoreline of Japan. And by that time, everybody should have been in formation. Well, the second airplane didn't get in formation as fast as he should have, so Sweeney lost about 20 minutes on that deal. 20 minutes was critical enough that they had a problem of releasing the bomb visually at the aiming point they were directed to do. I can tell it now because Behan, they didn't have enough fuel to carry that bomb back, and they would have had a problem defusing it if they had tried to take it back. So on the basis of that, Behan, when they made a second circle over Nagasaki, he told Sweeney, I got the airplane. That means he clutched in the bomb sight to the autopilot, he took it over, and he dropped it off about 1,000 yards from the initial aim point, but he recognized a place there that was a positive identification, and based on what we knew that time, the 1,000-foot error at that point wouldn't have made that much difference, and it didn't. But I think all in all, the mission was really well done under the circumstances.
What shockwave did you experience as you left the target?
When we made the turn, after the bomb left the airplane, approximately 10,000 pounds released. This time the airplane nose wants to go up. I'm pulling it to my side as fast as I can to make my turn. 51 seconds later, I'm out of it, and I just roll out as the thing explodes and shockwave comes up. My tail gunner sees it coming. It didn't, at 51 seconds it wasn't up there. We had to wait a couple of 3 seconds for it to get up there and hit us. Accelerometer in the airplane showed 2.5 Gs. We got three bumps out of it. The first one was 2.5. I don't know what the second one was, but it was half of that. And the third one we had to kind of wait and anticipate it hitting the airplane.
Yes.
What the most difficult mission was over Europe?
Yeah, the subject is your missions over Europe, and talk about the situation in the Mediterranean and European theater during the early days.
What's most difficult?
Are you all bearing with me?
It was difficult.
We're doing great now.
Yes, it was difficult, George.
Your most difficult mission also.
Well, in a sense of the word, let me put it this way. The most difficult was the first one. Now, we encountered the least opposition, but it was the most difficult because I always tell everybody it was a pure case of the blind leading the blind. We didn't know anything. We had really been, I guess the best word to say, we had been frightened. We had been scared by the RAF. The RAF kept telling us, and this was a part of the politics of the business, the RAF wanted the U.S. to augment their effort, and they were night bombers, and we were daylight, high-altitude bombers. They had tried daylight, they tried high altitude, and they had lost their shirt. They lost everything that they threw out there, and they said, you cannot exist. And they sent all kinds of people up to Polbrook, where we were, to talk to us and tell us about how quickly we were going to get shot down by doing what we were doing. Well, for mission out, we were apprehensive because we didn't know except what the British had told us. The mission took off, we assembled reasonably well, we got our fighter escort, and we crossed the channel and we got on the other side. We're riding along without much to do at that particular point when we start seeing black puffs up around us. Well, everybody looked, and I'm not trying to be facetious, we didn't understand what aircraft artillery was until it got closer to us. And then we could smell the cordite, and we knew that somebody was angry. They were shooting at us. We had a couple airplanes get hit. The fighters came up. We had the RAF there trying to scare them off. But then the fight, you know, the air battle started, not aggressively as they became later, because the Germans were trying to feel us out. That was their method of doing things. They didn't want to come barging in. They wanted to kind of pick here, pick there, and see. They realized that the B-17 was more heavily armed than any airplane that the British had that they'd been up against at this point. We flew a tight formation, which gave 3 times the number of guns that they had to face from anything that they'd ever faced before, and they were cautious on that. We bombed our target and missed the hell out of it, but turned around and got back home, and, you know, we thought we were doing real great. I think the roughest mission that we ever had was when we went to bomb the submarine pens in St. Nazaire, because they were tough. They had those submarine pens protected real well by fighters and by anti-aircraft. And believe it, it just makes a fella feel real bad to watch 1,100 pounders, armor-piercing bombs go down and hit and come back up in the air and explode. That's what they were doing. Those sub pens were tough. I went to France, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago down there to the Dassault, Spatial manufacturers to look at a business jet airplane that they were building, and the men at that factory took us in to look at those sub pens. And man, when you get inside of it, you could see they had concrete in some places that was over reinforced concrete that was 20 feet thick. So that was the worst. We got beat up pretty bad. We lost airplanes right and left. Had a lot of people wounded, badly killed, and so forth. I got one. I'll digress just a minute to get off of this subject. It's a little bit gory, but today, God bless them, they've got a lot of women in the Air Force, and every time I go to Maxwell, they always ask one question: do you believe in a woman going into combat? And I say, no, I'll tell you why I don't. Because I was raised to respect women, to think that she was a little bit different and so forth on, and I said, I saw too many men laying on floors of bombers with their guts hanging out and bleeding all over the place, and I don't think I'd like to look at a woman that way. I didn't get any more questions.
I've heard that we only had 3 atomic devices, 3 that we used. The 3 were bombed and 1 was tested. Is that true?
When we bombed Nagasaki, when we bombed Hiroshima, we had 2 other weapons that were ready for use. The one that was on the island, ready to go, and was used at Nagasaki. There was another one at Wendover, and I had a bomber airplane sitting out there with that thing sitting inside of it for a crew to fly it over to us if we needed it. Now, there were other parts and pieces, but there were no assembled bombs other than that. We would have been about 7 or 8 days getting another assembled weapon.
But we had the capability to keep on.
We had a capability, but it was not what you would call a reliable capability as far as being able to depend upon X number of weapons at certain intervals. No.
Why was the first one brought over on Indianapolis rather than Columbus?
The first one, the pure uranium material, was so expensive and was needed so badly to make that weapon work that they couldn't afford to risk it all in one place. They flew half of the material over in a transport airplane, the other with 2 guys carrying it. The other half was on the Indianapolis. The Nagasaki weapon, the U-235, was not as expensive as pure uranium. Expensive to manufacture or dollar cost, was not nearly as expensive. And they could replace that if they lost it, so they just started it right out in a transport airplane. One of my transport went and got it down at Los Alamos and brought it right on out to the islands.
General Tibbets, I understand from some of the things that I've read, was there a little bit of a conflict prior to the Hiroshima mission as to who was going to in the left seat of your airplane?
Well, you might have heard that, but as I said, you're talking to the guy that will assure you there was no conflict. I was the commander. I was commander of that outfit, and I was going to fly that airplane. Another thing, there was no other pilot in that outfit that had ever been shot at. I had been. I knew what I'd do if they started shooting at me, but I didn't know what anybody else would do. I had more time by 3 times the number of hours of anybody else to B-29, so I felt that I was qualified to do it. Especially since I devised the tactics and did all of the test work and so forth. I dropped 14 of those things before I ever went over to Tinian. I dropped them out, they were inert, but I dropped them on the salt flats. First off, to find out if they'd go where we wanted them to go. We had trouble initially doing that. Some of the other crews dropped some of those that if we pointed down this way, it ended up over here. Because, I mean, you couldn't guide them very well. We had to really work on that thing and get our ballistics down to where we could rely on them. And about the last 14 of those things, I did that myself, and that's why I was convinced we were ready to go. We had dummy powder charges in it. We could photograph the explosion. They were set to ignite at 1,500 feet above the surface of the earth. As they came down, that's where they were set to explode. And we photographed to find out, well, they exploded at 1,200 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, which really was negligible as far as air is concerned.
On the right, here's a question.
Did you encounter any fighter aircraft? Or any aircraft?
No, we encountered no difficulty, and I attribute this to 2 things. First off, the Japanese at that particular time were trying to conserve everything that they could. They didn't want to burn any fuel. They didn't want to take a chance on losing any airplanes because they were counting on an invasion. Number 2, for over a week before we went up there, I sent single airplanes up there with these practice bombs in them to fly around and drop bombs on places that had already been bombed, because oil refineries, steel mills, and something, there was always a building of some kind sitting there as an aiming point, and we sent crews up to do that. I wanted the people to do 2 things. First off, I wanted to think that a single airplane wasn't going to really cause them any great problem. I also sent airplanes up to do weather checking, and I want to think as reconnaissance. And actually, we're told now, Japanese history or people that have investigated, they did believe it was reported when they saw us coming or heard us coming that we were just more reconnaissance airplanes. Don't pay attention to them.
Yes, here.
2 questions. Did you have any fire detection or
Any
escort
fighters?
on the...
No, we had no protection. We didn't have a fighter in those days that could fly the distance that we could fly with the B-29, so they couldn't escort us. And the second thing is, we didn't want any fighters up there in that area because of not knowing exactly what the effect of the bomb would be and that sort of thing. I mean, somebody had said one time, I talked to some fighter pilots that said, well, they had P-38s on Okinawa and they could have sent them up there. Probably they could. But we didn't want them. I was convinced in my mind that that extra bit of altitude would take real good care of me.
What did you consider more of a threat on conventional bomb run, the anti-aircraft or the enemy fighters?
Which was a more conventional threat on the bomb run, anti-aircraft or fighters?
It would have been anti-aircraft if there had been any anti-aircraft in the Japanese hands that would shoot that high with accuracy. But we knew from past experience that they didn't have nearly the accuracy of radar-controlled guns that the Germans had. They did their weapons were supposed to be accurate only to 22,000 feet. Now after that, they're less than accurate, but they're dangerous. I felt that 33,000 feet was just that much more insurance, and that's where we bombed, at 33,000.
Germans were mighty good, weren't they?
He said the Germans were good, were they not?
Oh, I guarantee you they were good. Yeah, the Germans were very good. They were very accurate.
Partner?
Could you tell us a little bit about the bikini experiment?
The bikini test.
Bikini project.
About the things that were fun?
Okay, the Bikini Project was conducted for two basic purposes. Number one was really to find out what would the weapon do against the material that we had available to us in a war theater. That included battleships, cruisers, and all of that sort of thing. That was one question. But behind the whole thing was a fight between the Air Force and the Navy. The Navy had always been the strategic arm of the United States, and this is a strategic weapon, and they wanted the weapon. The Air Force said, we are the strategic arm of the United States, because we can not only go fly over the water, we can fly over the land and make the delivery. We have the equipment to do it, we have the training, we have, well, okay, so it's a big argument. And so therefore, the thing got down to a decision, political decision. We will test the weapon, we will find out who in reality should have that as their main striking arm. All right. The decision was made. I was in on the planning for it. The Navy, when they first got the lagoon out there at Bikini, they wanted to put all the ships basically in a straight line, one behind the other and that sort of thing. And I advocated that if we do that, of course, that will help us to have a larger bombing area than about anything I could think of. Now, if we would use those vessels and put them in a shape that would represent a target that you shoot at with rifles. It has a line in the center, then it has rings around it, you know, the 10 ring and whatever they are. I'm not a rifleman. But anyway, different distances out in circumference or diameter across the circle would be a line of ships, so that if you miss the bullseye, you're still going to get a recordable type of a damage. The first problem that came up was the Navy said, well, we can't put the vessels in that kind of a position. There's no way to do it. But somehow or other, somebody convinced them it could be done. And they did. They made all of those vessels and everything out there were put into circles with the bullseye, I forget which, I think it was the Missouri, wasn't it? No, not the Missouri, with the, one of the battleships was the...
Nevada, was it?
Nevada, okay. That was the center of the thing. And on the basis of that, the Bikini tests were conducted. They were very, actually they were very informative, those tests. We learned an awful lot from them. And unfortunately, we didn't get to sink that battleship the way we thought we were going to. That was, again, another political decision that was made at the Air Force part of it. And when that happened, Behan was the man that tried the bombardier on that airplane to listen to it, because he knew what data he was going to put into his bomb site. And before they could arrive at the target to make their bomb run, Behan took Farabee and myself to a planned layout of this situation on the operations wall, and he said, this is where that bomb is going to hit. And he drew an X mark at short and left by 1,700 feet. Behan missed it by 100 feet. They were 1,600 feet short and left, which didn't help the Air Force much.
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know just a few little personal things. Do you have any children? How long have you been married? And I'd like for you to introduce us to your lovely wife.
Well, the answer is yes, we've got children. There are 3 boys involved. Andrea and I were each married before. She had 1 boy, and I had 2. Her son got a daughter, 9 years old. I've got 5 grandchildren from 2 boys. One of them has 3, and one of them has 2. The oldest boy is 16. The oldest girl is well, he's 17, because, yeah, he's had a driver's license now for... he's had a driver's license well over a year, so the girl just got hers, so she's 16, he's 17. There's only a year difference between the 2 of them. And the other girl in the same family is, what is she, 12 or 13? Stacy. Gene, my youngest boy, Gene has a girl that is 16, because she got her driver's license this past summer. That's how I keep track of it. They want Grandpa's Corvette. Grandpa solved that problem. He sold it. Anyway, the other boy is Gina's 16 and Chuck is 12, and Jimmy's girl, that little girl, is 9 years old. I must say that Andrea and I have undertaken something that, I don't know, we're having a good time. We are having the granddaughter live with us this year because we got a grandniece from France that's living with us and going to school so she can learn English. The granddaughter gets to learn French. Grandma gets to translate homework 3 or 4 different ways.
Yes. Are you getting tired?
Huh?
Are you okay? We don't want to wear you out.
Look at, I don't wear easy. I don't want to, believe me, I don't want to bore you, but I said, Andrea and I are spending the night here. It's very seldom to go to bed before midnight. If you can endure it, I can, because as I told the doctor, I expected to have more fun out of this than you folks.
This man is not one to make understatements, but I was looking in his book here. He was quoted in the Tibbets story as saying, describing the time when he met Andrea in France about 1947.
No, we were in the 50s then.
All right, in the 50s. And he described her, says she's very charming and intelligent. That's an understatement, and I'd like for her to stand and you to meet Andrea Tibbets. You'll see how beautiful she is. A couple of more questions. We won't much longer. Yes. All right.
In your outfit, how many of the B-29s were capable of carrying atom bombs?
How many of your 15?
All of them. As a matter of fact, we had 18 airplanes that were capable. I left 3 of them in Wendover, Utah. I left 1 to carry the next bomb out. I left 2 to continue working with the scientists back there on some of the experimental stuff that we're doing. Those airplanes, by the way, they were built by the Martin airplane plant at Omaha, and I've had Boeing engineers tell me that Martin built the best B-29 was ever built by anybody. Martin had a reputation of being the best manufacturer. They had the reputation of being the worst designer. Hey, let me tell you a story. Speaking of Martin airplanes, and with all due respect to the lady pilots in here, do you remember the Martin D26 airplane, or have you heard about it? They had all kinds of names for it. They called it a vagrant, you know, because it had no visible means of support and all that kind of stuff. The Martin airplane was the first airplane to come out with what we call a high-lift wing. Thin airfoil, high-lift wing. Now, the saying was, and it was almost true, 1 a day in Tampa Bay. Because that's where the first D26 transition took place, was at Tampa, Florida. When you got crawled up into the airplane, you crawled up at the rear section of right underneath, just behind the wing. You went up inside to get up into the fuselage of it, and on the way up on your right side was an electrical panel. It had the generator switches on it. It had circuit breakers and a few things. You were supposed to energize, or you were supposed to turn the generators on at that particular time when you crawled up to go get into the cockpit to start pre-flight and take the airplane off. Now, people got to do this, put the generator switches on. The airplane had electrical props on them. So most cases, and it had dual batteries in it, but most of the times you had just enough electrical power in your batteries to get the engines cranked up, to use your radios to get your taxi instructions, be given a clearance to take off, and get just about 20 feet off of the ground when you had no electrical power. Your props went flat and you went down. That's why they went into Tampa Bay. There's another reason. The airplane with the high lift wing, it had to have a high angle of attack, which means a nose high attitude to take off. Our pilots, we didn't understand this. Nobody explained it to us because we had always been flying underpowered airplanes with large airfoils on them, slow, but they'd lift off of the ground and they just come up like this. But because they didn't have much power, your instructors or anybody that was checking you out in one of these airplanes says, now don't pull the nose too high, because if you do, you're going to stall out. And so you'd be going along and you're trying to get, you know, go through this thing and get this up in the air, and pretty soon you feel somebody push forward on the yoke, and it's to get your nose down. The fellas started flying this airplane without that knowledge. When they had all of the electrical power they needed to keep the props running and so forth and make a takeoff, they ran out of runway. So the first thing they did when they finally had no more runway left in front of them, this airplane wouldn't run down the runway, take off, because it had a negative angle of attack on the ground. They'd pull back on the yoke, and of course the airplane would go right up in the air. It was normal for that thing to have about an 18 to 20 degree deck angle to properly climb it. It had the power to do it. So here's a guy sitting there, and all of a sudden here's the nose up in front of me. Oh my God, I'm going to stall. So he pushes it down too quick. It's a heavy airplane. It goes into the ground, and he wraps it up that way. It took a lot to learn. Okay, so it had a terrible reputation. I had been on the West Coast one time. After I got back from Europe, I was working with the B-29 deal. I'd been on the West Coast. I came back through Pueblo, Colorado. I had to stop fuel. I was flying a B-25. I had to stop for fuel. I stopped at Pueblo, pulled up in front of the operations the way I was signaled to, and just about the time that I was getting out of there, filling out the forms after getting out of the airplane, here comes the B-26, boom, right in front of me. And I saw this little head sitting in the cockpit. And I looked, and I thought, gosh, that's a small guy flying that airplane. And next thing I see some legs coming down out of there wearing a blue flying suit. And I've got this line chief out there, and I said, what's that? He said, that's a wasp. I said, what's a wasp? He said, a girl pilot. I said, what are they doing flying that B-26? He said, well, they fly them all the time for tow target work. Well, that really got to me. Here's these little girls flying a B-26, and all of these big guys are afraid of them. I couldn't rest until I got into a B-26. I had to find out what it is that makes somebody not want to fly a B-26. I got put in one quicker than I expected, because I ran out of a plane one day at Marietta, Georgia, and they had, I don't know, they had 20 of them sitting around there. I borrowed one to get to Wichita, Kansas. First time I'd ever been in it. But the thing was great. It was a fine airplane, stable. It was fast for an airplane those days. It was just a beautiful thing to fly, no problem at all. As a matter of fact, on my first flight, about 150 miles this side of Wichita, lost right engine. And I had a couple of Boeing engineers with me, and we call in, trimmed out the airplane, and flying along on one engine, and we come in to make a landing. One of the guys is a little bit of a nervous flyer, and he's sitting right behind me on a jump seat behind me. And I'm bringing the thing in, turning on final approach. Fire trucks and every ambulances and all are out there, because I told them I was coming in with one engine. We're getting down, I don't know, 200 feet or something, a quarter of a mile behind the runway. He tapped me on the shoulder. He said, how do these things land on one engine? I said, I'm deaf, I know. I never landed one on one engine. But anyway, he didn't ride with me again. We had trouble with B-29s not being flown at Alamogordo by all of these big football heroes from all of the colleges all over the United States. They had a class of heroes that they had down there. They wanted to make B-29 instructors. These guys would get up, they'd crank up, they'd get out and run up an engine, check on the end of the runway, abort and come on back. So anyway, a general by the name of Barney Giles stopped me one day. He told me this story. I didn't know about it. He said, what can we do to make those airplanes get more utilization per day? He said, there's nothing wrong with them, the airplanes. And I said, well, I don't know, but I got an idea. And he said, what's that? And I told him the story about the girls in the B-26, and I had to fly one. So he smiled. He said, do you think you can do it? I said, I can train two to fly that airplane without any problem. He gave me a green light. I got two girls. One by the name of Dora Doherty and the other by the name of Dee Dee Mormon. And I took them to Birmingham, Alabama at the Mod Center, so we'd have all the B-29s that we needed, and we could just fly and fly and fly. And I worked those girls over for about 5 days. Dora was an excellent pilot. You could show her something once and she could do it next time. There was no problem. And she wasn't the least bit concerned about it. My flight engineer, after 2 or 3 rides with him, he said, hell, I'll fly with that girl anytime. I said, good. We cheated a little bit because I knew that with certain weights the airplane would fly on 3 engines, with a little less weight it'd fly on 2 engines. So I got the girls all checked out to where they would take the B-29, they'd start down the runway, and as soon as it broke ground, they'd feather an aboard engine. And once they got the wheels and the flaps tucked up, they feathered the other one right beside, climbed on out on 2 engines. Well, I'm telling you, I didn't do these guys' laundry after they had the first ride, but I understand it was dirty. B-29 started flying to beat hell.
Were you satisfied with the presentation on television about the story about Enola Gay?
Were you satisfied with the TV presentation about Enola Gay?
I would have to tell you yes, because first off, I didn't have anything to do with the production of the film. I did get to put in my say-so on the script. They had, unfortunately, 3 different writers that started on that thing. The first one died, the second one quit or something, I don't know. But by the time they got through with it, I thought with the corrections that were suggested, the producers wanted to do as good a film as they could do. The next thing is that I understand later from the producers that the young actors that they hired to portray us in that film all volunteered to do it for less money than they were getting for doing other type of film work, because they wanted to be in on it. They thought it was going to be a great picture. And the director of the thing, when he got all through with it and I saw that, I told him, I said, man, you're more than a director, you're a magician. Because they had 2 B-29s, one of which wouldn't fly. And you saw the thing? The next thing is they made all of those pictures look like Japan and so forth. Well, that was at Magoo in California. What they had done is they got artists to paint pictures and do all of this stuff so that it looked like you were looking at a scene in Japan. They followed a reasonably accurate portrayal of incidents. They rearranged incidents to give the story a continuity that they wanted to give in the film. So I think that as I say, I think that, you know, Patrick Duffy portrayed me. I talked to Patrick Duffy on one occasion, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours. I went to his house and spent some time with him. The only thing that I did as far as the film is concerned, I went to Tucson, Arizona, to Davis-Monthan. That's where they did most of their filming. I went there because they wanted me to act as an advisor for the so-called night takeoff. Nobody was sure exactly what the sequence of events were, how the night takeoff took place and all that. So I went out there and was there the night that they made that filming. I got in the day before and I was there that night and left the next day. So that's as much as I had to do with it. But as I say, I gave the producer, when they asked me, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you 85 to 90%. That's his grade.
We've neglected the right side. We'll take one more from over here. If someone had a question, I believe there was a minute ago. Yes, Sheila.
I understand your position.
Loudly.
In the year that you did what you did, having 5 daughters for you and
You'll have-
daughters and whatever, how would you react if you were in a command position today? Would you accept a Sally Ride type person, or would you still to the fact that she was of a particular sex?
With daughters, would you accept a Sally Ride type person if you were in command of an operation these days? I think that's, she's speaking as a lady pilot with 5 daughters.
Now look at, the answer is yes, I would, because I think that I was probably one of the first to advocate using these girls. Now, I didn't tell you, Dora and Dee Dee Mormon did a beautiful job flying the B-29, but when I went to Wendover, out there in, as Hope said, leftover, I had to get all my supplies out of the Oklahoma City depot. When I sent mail crews to Oklahoma City from Wendover, Utah, airplane had more damn engine problems and troubles than you could possibly imagine. But if I said, and now Dee Dee Mormon was married to an Air Force pilot, and she did not go to Wendover. A young lady by the name of Mary Helen Gosnell joined us and went out there because she had been at Grand Island. And Dora had two. Dora was flying C-46s and B-17s at Grand Island. And anyway, she and Mary Helen would take off from Wendover, Utah. They would fly to Oak City, which in a Goonie Bird, or later in the C-54. In a Goonie Bird, it was about a 6-hour run. I could count on them being back in 18 hours. But as I say, it'd be 3 or 4 days to get a mail crew back.
Let's bring an end to the questions, as popular as they are. General Tibbets, I think you can recognize the enthusiasm of the crowd, and we have been honored and excited to have you here. I hope you don't consider this to be a demotion, but we know that you're a brigadier general. You're now a colonel, a Kentucky colonel on the staff of Governor Martha Lane Collins. We'd like you to have this.
Oh, thank you.
And also, if I may open this little box here, I'd like you to take this out and hold it up for the group. The opening is right there.
I don't want it to bite you and have me
No,
drop
sir.
it.
No, sir. This is a Kentucky Colonel Julep Cup, and when you accept a Kentucky colonelcy and a Julep Cup, you become one of us.
Appreciate it.
And we'd like for you to come back and see us again. We do
Doctor.
appreciate so much your being here.
Doctor, I've enjoyed every minute.